Tuesday afternoon webinar. Starting just minutes late. We're very glad to have you here and very happy to have our special guest. It's a very important topic today. It gives me pleasure to introduce Dr. Michael Jenkins, president of the Washington Times Foundation, which sponsors the Washington Brief and this webcast. He's also chairman of the Times Holdings, LLC, that owns the Times News organizations, held a number of well-received fact-finding trips to Korea, Japan, where they traditionally meet with the legislative, executive, intel, and military leadership of those countries. And as president of the nonprofit NGO Universal Peace Federation, which often co-sponsors these events, Dr. Jenkins has decades-long experience conducting peace initiatives all over the world, particularly in the hot spots, Northeast Asia and the Middle East. We're very happy to have you here. Welcome, Dr. Jenkins.
Thank you, Larry. Thank you for all you do for the Universal Peace Federation and our work together. We're very honored to present experts on the Korean Peninsula today. We are looking at the situation of the terrible tragedy of COVID, really devastating the country and its people, and we don't wish that on anyone. President Yoon and also President Biden and others have offered to send vaccines there by the millions. That's been rejected. We get mixed reviews, mixed reports on what's really going on, and hopefully there'll be some new insight from our expert commentators today. I'd like to introduce first Mr. Greg Scarlatu. He's the director of the Committee for Human Rights in North Korea. And Greg is the executive director and leader of this committee, and he also coordinated 28 HRNK publications addressing North Korea's human rights. He's visiting professor at Korea's prestigious Hankook University for Foreign Studies. And he also is one of the educators at the U.S. State Department's Foreign Service Institute. We are really honored to present to you at this time Mr. Greg Scarlatu. He has a Master's of Arts in Law, Diplomacy from Fletcher School, Tufts University, a Master of Arts, Bachelor of Arts from Seoul National University's Department of International Relations. He's an expert on Korea. He's also an expert on the European area of concern in terms of conflict and human rights. And he is working very much with Japan, Korea, and also the US and trilateral coordination. I'd like to present to you at this time a dear friend and a great thinker and a great commentator on this issue, Mr. Greg Scarlatu. Welcome, Greg.
Michael, Dr. Jenkins, thank you very much for the kind introduction. It's great to be with this august crew and amongst great friends. So what do we know about what's going on in North Korea? We know that pretty much most other countries all over the world are finally overcoming this global pandemic through vaccination, distancing, masking, lots and lots of different other means. What happened in North Korea? Well, early on, the regime of Kim Jong-un addressed COVID-19 as a public health crisis, but very soon, as it always happens in North Korea, COVID-19 prevention was politicized. Of course, everyone has had to put some restrictions in place. That said, North Korean restrictions have been absolutely draconian, and practically the North Korean regime has taken advantage of COVID prevention to crack down on factors it perceived as undermining the regime's legitimacy and grip on power. What does that mean? The regime placed draconian restrictions on cross-border traffic. For example, Friendship Bridge between the Chinese city of Dandong and the North Korean city of Sinŭiju was practically shut down at times for quite extended periods of time. The regime has also cracked down on entrepreneurship and market activity. As we all know, in the mid to late 1990s, North Korea experienced a tragic humanitarian catastrophe, the Konane, the Great Famine. Since then, informal markets have developed in North Korea, providing a survival mechanism to the people of North Korea. Now that the public distribution system is no longer reliable, the regime, under the pretext of COVID, has cracked down on market activity to the point that people to make buns their homes and sell them on the streets are no longer allowed to do that. Of course, China has also cracked down on street vendors, but compared to China, North Korean people really have to depend on these market activities for their own survival. I am in contact and I work closely with a multitude of North Korean escapees. The constant and consistent message I get from them, based on sources they have inside the country, is that because of this crackdown on markets, in absolute terms, the humanitarian situation in North Korea today is worse than it was in the 1990s. However, in relative terms, people are not dying by the thousands and hundreds of thousands as they did in the 1990s, because they have developed survival skills. They've learned how to go up into the mountains, pick herbs and trade and bargain and barter. So they have survival skills. They understand that they can no longer depend on the regime for their survival, and they survive despite all of these draconian restrictions that the regime has put into place. The Kim Jong-un regime has also taken advantage of COVID to impose restrictions on information getting into North Korea and information getting out of the country. They have instated new judicial and extrajudicial punishment to basically target those who attempt to access information from the outside world, especially those who spread information from the outside world into North Korea. They're employing new technology to repel the information offensive coming in from the outside world. They're using new content for both domestic and outside purposes. So the information counteroffensive is very much part of this. Now, finally, after practically 2.5 years of restrictions, claiming that they had no cases of COVID, the North Korean regime has finally admitted that they have a COVID outbreak on their hands. The point that I would like to make is that everything we know about the North Korean COVID outbreak is based on North Korean statistical data. North Korea basically kicked out foreign diplomats, foreign NGO workers, UN personnel. This environment was simply no longer conducive to an international presence in North Korea. North Korea has had a problem with transparency and access inside the country for decades. Things are at an all-time low, so everything we know depends on information provided by the North Korean regime. As we all know, North Koreans are very good at doctoring data. They're not as good at collecting their own data. One example, our colleagues at 38 North, Martin Williams, who also happens to be an HRNK author, and the others at 38 North have been compiling all of this data provided by the North Korean regime. That's been very helpful. This is all we know. We can only operate with this data. So basically what we know, based on the most recent reporting by 38 North, is that a total of 4.5 million people have been sickened and recovered. It appears that the number of cases of new cases is going down. It seems that the total number of cases fell in every region of the country, but the number of newly diagnosed cases rose slightly in two areas. One is Rason Sombong, where they used to have that special economic zone, and Kaesong, which for years was a focal point of inter-Korean cooperation, and also the location of the liaison office that the South Koreans built and the North Koreans blew up. How is COVID different from what happened in North Korea in the 1990s? Well, in the 1990s, North Korea experienced the Great Famine. If one looks, for example, at the book authored by Professor Ambassador Andrew Natsios, former USAID administrator, The Great North Korean Famine, one can see how the North Korean regime diverted resources away from people who are not critical to the survival of the regime. Resources were directed toward the military, the nukes North Korea was producing, the ballistic missiles, the military, and the key elites by providing them access to luxury goods imported from the outside world. So during the famine, resources based on loyalty-based system of social classification. One big difference between what's happening now, COVID, and the Great Famine is that the COVID virus knows no boundaries. The COVID virus does not understand the Songbun system of social classification, and the COVID virus can really pose a threat to the very survivability of the Kim regime. If they end up with a massive outbreak, for example, in the capital city of Pyongyang, which is the seat of power and privilege, and at least based on the North Korean data that we have, it seems that they have had a major outbreak in the capital city of Pyongyang. Now, maybe that's where the major outbreak is. Maybe the regime is focusing again resources such as testing kits on the capital city of Pyongyang, and they've identified so many cases because they're testing in Pyongyang and not elsewhere in North Korea. We don't know why the North Korean regime decided to admit that they're experiencing a COVID outbreak. Personally, and based on interactions with sources within the ESKP community and also inside North Korea, it's more difficult to talk to people inside North Korea, but not entirely impossible. A COVID problem had been unfolding for a while, and perhaps it reached the point where they could no longer deny that they had cases. Perhaps they're simply manipulating data to fabricate a unique North Korean story in combating COVID. We don't know that either. But one sure thing is that we have entered an age of pandemics. And I'm afraid that this is not the worst we have seen. And the humanitarian situation of North Korea is dire. The human security of North Korean people is very precarious. Their health, food, economic, political, environmental, community security, that makes them very vulnerable to COVID and to any other disease, any other pandemic. After all, 1/3 of North Korea's children are malnourished. The people of North Korea suffer from nutritional deficiencies that make them vulnerable to COVID and any other pandemic. Do they need help? Yes. Do we want to help? Yes. In order to help, we need to know what the problem is. We need to know who's experiencing what health issues, what age groups, what gender, what region, what nutritional deficiencies are we dealing with, what groups are most vulnerable. In order to find out all of these answers, we need transparency, we need access inside the country. They denied, as you said in the introduction, COVAX assistance, they denied South Korean assistance at the early stages, even Russian and Chinese assistance. So we want to help. In order to help, we need access, we need transparency. Just like any good doctor, we need to diagnose the problem first before we plan an intervention. And before we proceed with an intervention, thank you very much for listening. Again, great honor and privilege to be in this exquisite company today. I look forward to the Q&A. Thank you very much.
Michael, you're on mute.
Thank you. Thank you so much, Greg. I can't believe how precise your insights are, always very, very focused and clear. I would like to present at this time Mr. Doug Bondo, Senior Fellow at the Cato Institute in Washington. He specializes in foreign policy and civil liberties, worked as a special assistant to President Ronald Reagan, has been the editor of the political magazine Inquiry. He writes regularly for Fortune, National Interest, the Wall Street Journal, and the Washington Times, and periodicals like Foreign Policy, Harper's, National Review, The New Republic, and many, many others. We're really very, very much interested to hear from Doug. He always gives very precise and accurate information and also analysis, and he helps really guide our nation's leaders in making decisions on how to better advocate peace between North and South Korea and other troubled points in the world. He's been on ABC, CBS, all the networks, CNN, Fox regularly. Got his bachelor's degree at Florida State University in Tallahassee. Got his law degree at the prestigious Stanford University Law School. And he has really been a strong voice in the world of our think tank community, advising our senators, congressmen, as well as the NGOs throughout America. And he's also on the faculty of the Acton Institute for Study of Religion and Liberty. He's a Robert A. Taft Fellow at the American Conservative Defense Alliance and Senior Fellow in the International Religious Persecution at the Institute on Religion and Public Policy. Let's welcome Doug Bondo. Welcome back, Doug.
Michael, thanks so very much for that very generous introduction. It's a great pleasure to be here and talking about this issue and to join Greg on these issues. I would say my analysis comes very close to his. I think that a situation we face today is a very challenging one. You know, North Korea is obviously a dangerous state. We've certainly seen that with missile tests. Fear, the presumption we're probably going to have a nuclear test in the not too distant future. A human rights record that's awful, as Greg's organization has really helped show us and demonstrate. But at the same time, it's also one of the most vulnerable countries. I mean, the North likes to present itself as this very powerful nation holding off, the United States, the South Korea, et cetera. But of course, it's extraordinarily vulnerable. And these vulnerabilities play out for those who are most at risk. And it's a tragedy what we're seeing happening in North Korea. Excuse me. In April, we had what appeared to be a mass epidemic. The North talked about fever infections, and it was fairly clear that meant COVID. They gave us numbers, but by earlier in June, they were telling us things were getting better. That they were, basically, down 69 deaths at one point. They told us that, they were dealing with this, and this is a country that is extraordinarily at risk. It's one of only 2 countries on earth that has not vaccinated its population. Eritrea is the other, and Eritrea is actually called the North Korea of Africa, and that is not a compliment. Their healthcare system is very primitive, very rough. They don't have mass testing kits. They don't have all of the medicine and everything necessary for treatment. Very rudimentary, kind of, treatment system. Very impoverished infrastructure. A country that's one of the poorest on earth. There's no cushion there for lockdown. I mean, in the United States, we could give people money, when we close down businesses. North Korea does not have billions of dollars, trillions of dollars to hand out to its population. Nevertheless, it says that it has successfully addressing this issue. And the predictions we read about are that it will fairly soon announce that it has succeeded, had victory over COVID. And There's been a recent report of intestinal diseases spreading. Presumably that's something different, but again, one doesn't really know exactly what's going on in this country. They have continuing problems of food and agriculture, a lot of other issues going on, but they are making the claim that they are dealing with COVID. And the question then is what happened and what do we know? And as Greg indicated, frankly, we don't know. We don't see any evidence of mass death, like that during the arduous march, as they called the Great Famine. So presumably people are dying, but not in the numbers of a mass epidemic. There just should have been some more evidence there. And the question then is, what is going on? One theory is that to some degree, this was concocted. That is, they exaggerated that there was some infection. They exaggerated to suggest a crisis, which allows them, number one, to declare success in defeating it. Number two, allows them to crack down on other activities, as Greg indicated, crack down on independent markets, crack down on incoming information. They're very, very nervous about information coming in, particularly from South Korea. Kim Jong-un back in, I think it was 2017, had a K-pop concert. So at one point seemed to want to bring this in, but now young people go to jail if they are found to be dancing to K-pop songs, singing them, if they talk in ways that sound kind of South Korean. So this allows them, kind of under the pretense of providing health controls, to seal the border. Very hard to get information in. And it also presumably allows them to some degree to try to build that sense of unity. Everyone must rally around the supreme leader. Everyone must be in service of the state. So this may very well be, in terms of some of what we saw, very much a political exercise. And on the other hand, this is a system that is extraordinarily vulnerable. And I think that the problem here is that even if what we've just gone through is to some degree exaggerated, we could have this in the future. As Greg indicated, COVID does not stop. COVID does not hold off at the Chinese border and decide we won't pass the Yalu, that they could run into a mass epidemic of the sort we thought might be happening, and that could be devastating for them. There's discussions that they want to start reopening at least some of the economy. The rail line out of Sinuiju, Dandong, into the north of North Korea. The questions about whether or not they're going to allow more trade with China. What are they going to do in the future if they start opening up on economics? They're more likely to have contacts that might again bring in the virus. So the question is what to do looking into the future. And I think that what we have to do is, number one, it makes sense to try to reach out to offer vaccines. Now, as Greg indicated, they have turned down previous opportunities. If there's an opportunity to put together essentially all of the neighbors, and maybe this is something China would join in, to have the US, ROK, China, maybe Japan, collectively offer a nonpartisan, non-political, a vaccination program. The problem for the North, of course, is it's not just getting vaccines, it's keeping them refrigerated. It's actually, having the infrastructure to vaccinate millions of people. This would be extraordinarily difficult. Would North Korea, under any circumstances, be willing to allow in people from outside to help? That's certainly worth talking to our friends and China as well, which at this point is not so friendly. If there's an opportunity to try to put something together that might appeal to North Korea and being seen as non-political. I think it's also important for all of these countries to start talking amongst each other privately, but seriously, about what to do if there is a mass epidemic. What if, this system, really is kind of thrown into crisis? What if it nears collapse? What if there's mass infection? I mean, one could imagine an economy that stops working with lockdowns. One could imagine the elite. I mean, as Greg indicated, the fact you're a member of the inner circle of Kim Jong-un doesn't necessarily protect you. What if we see mass infections among the leadership? What if we see a fracturing of that leadership? What if we see conflict among different power centers? Imagine the confluence of famine, poverty, and COVID. the strains that would put on the North Korean system. And it's certainly worth talking now is what to do, because the fears, of course, mass refugee flows, loose nuclear weapons, potential military conflict and civil war, and that could overflow, of course, North Korea's boundaries. And I think it's worth trying to get at least the U.S., South Korea, and Japan on the same page of preferring reunification if that opportunity came, and what would that mean, and how would one promote that in a way that would be fair and reasonable and allow North Koreans to make the final decision. And I think the question of addressing China. And I think China in this is a very serious factor, where China, I suspect, does not want to see reunification. China's not really interested in seeing a unified Korea and American military presence. And China may very well be prepared to intervene militarily in a crisis and try to preserve a North Korea. So the question of how to work with China to avoid conflict of, if the South Korean military goes in, the Chinese goes in, to what to do in terms of how one convinces China to allow reunification to move forward. Would concessions be needed? These are things that's worth talking about and thinking about now. Because if there's a crisis, that is the worst moment to try to work all of this out. And my fear is that given everything that's out there, COVID, potential of famine, poverty, lockdowns, et cetera, that North Korea could easily have one of these. It's not guaranteed. They survived the terrible famine in the 1990s. Nevertheless, we need to be talking about this. And I think this is one for kind of the allies together to try to have their own position and then to come to some agreement on how to address China, which is particularly important on these issues. So these are huge issues. I mean, there's a huge humanitarian issue here of people of North Korea who are in such awful, terrible conditions. And there's also enormous security issues in terms of what could happen if that regime collapses, and then what comes out of that. So I'm looking forward to the discussion on this. Again, I appreciate the opportunity to contribute.
Thank you, Doug. We really are very curious about what's really going on. We see that just yesterday or this week, they shut down all COVID prevention materials assistance from China, which was unusual. Reuters just reported on that yesterday. During the pandemic time, they closed their borders to China as well as to all other countries, but especially China as their ally. They prevented any shipments coming in whatsoever, which was shocking. Was that due to the fear of COVID, or was it the fear of other ways to use those shipments to somehow subvert their influence over the people? Doug and Greg, you want to tell us about that? Why did they shut down the COVID prevention assistance yesterday? And also, why did they keep the border closed with China, who's their ally? Start with Doug, and then we'll come back to Greg.
Well, the presumption is they did have a fear of infection from the trade. They've created these mass disinfection centers for goods coming in, and apparently they sit in quarantine. So that certainly looks to me like, what they view as a health measure. At the same time, as we've mentioned, it's very convenient in terms of a tool of political control. That is, if you want to make it difficult for information to get in from the outside, it's pretty clear they are very nervous about this. And if you talk to defectors, all they have to do is see a video from South Korea. All they have to do is see a movie or a TV show, that shows Seoul. All they have to do is see this kind of information. And it's quite evident to them they've been lied to. And there's a very different system out of there. And that, I think, is probably the greatest, in many ways, the greatest danger for the regime. It's not military where they need nuclear weapons, but instead it's informational. So it wouldn't surprise me that they have conveniently used this. And why they shut down the centers yet, I'm not sure. I mean, it may be that they really believe they've solved this, or this is part of the image they want to present to the world. They prove they've solved it because they've ended treatment.
Yes, very, very relevant to the situation. Control of the population is definitely much more easy for the leadership under this kind of circumstances. We did have one of our programs that demonstrated that sometimes in the Chinese shipments, cell phones would also be shipped to the North Korean people for sale. They would be buying them. And, their cell phones don't reach beyond North Korea or the border of China, but it did give them the ability to communicate with one another. And Greg, you got any thoughts why they shut down the border from your point of view on COVID prevention materials?
Yes, I agree with all of Doug's excellent points. Of course, we have to remember that every decision in North Korea is a political decision. The Korean Workers' Party, in particular the Organization and Guidance Department, the OGD, is behind each and every decision made in North Korea. It all comes down to supreme leader guidance that's issued down to the local level, of course, with the advice of the OGD. The OGD inspects compliance with supreme leader guidance at the local level, reports back up the party chain of command. It's extraordinarily difficult for a party apparatchik. What is the fundamental strategic objective of a Korean Workers' Party apparatchik? Survival. Don't get purged, don't get killed, don't have your family sent to a camp. It's very difficult to recommend to the supreme leader something along the lines of, oh, dear supreme leader, we should really liberalize and open up the border, let Chinese goods come in. No, quite the contrary. Comrade supreme leader, we've got this guerrilla mentality. Everybody's after us. We're surrounded. You don't know what these foreigners are going to send in. You cannot even trust the Chinese. Forget about the Americans or the South Koreans or the Japanese or COVAX or everybody else. So the system is geared as such that it's centered on a guerrilla mentality, a zero-sum game, us versus them, complete isolation from the outside world. And regrettably for the people of North Korea, this is not a winning formula in the age of great pandemics in the 21st century. This isolation will have tragic effects for the people of North Korea. Michael, you're muted again.
Ambassador Sung Kim is the special representative of the United States to the DPRK. He's also currently the ambassador to Indonesia from the U.S. Very, very experienced and a very excellent diplomat, and we're encouraged by his involvement there. But he recently made a statement, June 7th, 2 weeks ago today, about the fact that 31 ballistic missiles have been tested in 2022, the most it's ever tested in a single year. And it surpasses the 25 that were tested in 2019, but we're only halfway through the year. He also indicated that there's been a tremendous effort to have communications with North Korea. He said they sent messages in multiple ways through third-party nations, directly in writing, and also have included specific proposals, including humanitarian cooperation, COVID-19 relief assistance, also the willingness to have conversations about practical steps both sides could take to address the security situation. They reached out to our allies, our partners, and the PRC to convey our openness to dialogue with Pyongyang. And yet, in all the years we've been doing fact finders with the Washington Times, and even the period before with Kim Jong-il, his father, it always seemed like they were on the brink of collapse. There's been so many expert discussions I've been in where they can't possibly last any longer. And we see time and again that actually they became stronger, even in the midst of starvation, even in the midst of this incredible COVID challenge and so forth, and the sanctions and all these different challenges. But to date, even Ambassador Sung Kim points out that they did not respond. They did not respond to our efforts. And it seems like the PRC is not really encouraging them too much to respond at this time. Any thoughts on that, Doug? What's the position of China right now with North Korea communicating with America?
Well, I think your analysis is absolutely right, Michael, is that we have made a real effort to talk to them. The Biden administration has made it very clear they want to talk to them. Poor President Moon spent, his final months in office desperately trying to convince them to talk to him. And even President Yoon has made it clear that, he's taking a tougher stance than President Moon, but that he wants to have dialogue. So this looks to me like this is not the previous case where, North Korea decides it's going to have to shoot off a missile to try to get our attention. It has our attention, and they're not interested in talking. So my fear there is that they've decided to take a pause and may very well have decided that this is the time to build up their missile arsenal and maybe do a couple more nuclear tests and position themselves so they can come back and say, we're prepared to negotiate, but not for denuclearization. We will negotiate over arms control. That is, we'll give you something, but there's no way we're giving up, our arsenal. So if you guys don't want us to go to 100, nuclear weapons or 150 or 200, imagine the number, you need to make a deal with us, and here are the terms. And I think the problem with China right now, not only China, but Russia plays a much smaller role, but both Russia and China, given their attitudes towards the US, are much more likely to see value in weaponizing North Korea, I think, against us than in cooperating with us. Now, I don't believe China really wants a nuclear North Korea, but both China and Russia vetoed the UN resolutions on the missiles.
Yes.
And the question is, what would they do on a nuclear test? That would be the real test for them. But I have trouble imagining that China would, in fact, impose more sanctions. I think at this stage, China's view is anything that makes it tougher on the US is in their interest, and certainly Russia would take the same position. So I don't think we can count on the PRC in any way.
Greg, you've been at this a long time. So what do you think about the way that they're treating the Biden administration? They have no need to communicate. They're developing everything they want. It appears that China is supporting them as more than ever, especially with the Ukraine-Russia conflict going on. They're doing everything they can to support Russia. China just has now increased its oil purchases from Russia, surpassing Saudi Arabia's supply to Russia. Unbelievable. What's your view on this current situation? Is there any need for them to communicate with the United States?
Michael and Doug, the answer is no, not for now. I agree with all the great points you have made. The fundamental strategic stance of China on North Korea has not changed. North Korea continues to be a vassal state, a buffer zone, a bargaining chip, a thorn in our side, in the side of the United States. They will continue to support them. I come across this at the UN all the time. Russia will do the same. We have another big problem on our hands right now. The UN Security Council is paralyzed. One P5, one permanent member of the UN Security Council, is committing genocide at the Uyghur concentration camps. Another P5 permanent member of the UN Security Council is committing war crimes in Ukraine, the Russian Federation. They vetoed measures to respond to North Korea's repeated missile launches this year. This situation would continue. Would it be possible to pass UN Security Council resolutions or new sanctions if North Korea detonated a nuke? No, I don't think so. Would it be possible to proceed with kinetic measures? No, I don't think so, because of the sheer threat of the mass and proximity of the North Korean military. 70% of 1.2 million men and women deployed in a forward-leaning position south of the Pyongyang-Wonsan line. I haven't even mentioned the nuclear weapons, the other weapons of mass destruction. So this is really a very difficult position. The North Korean regime is taking full advantage of the paralysis of the UN Security Council. 31 missile launches, as you mentioned. Why are they testing? Well, they're testing because in order to develop the program, first and foremost, you need to test. Then they're, of course, advertising the program to clients in the Middle East, in particular Iran. As you recall, the Musudan, a missile based on an old Soviet submarine launch ballistic missile, was first tested in Iran and not in North Korea. Of course, there's a political element here as well. They're trying to put pressure on the newly elected conservative president of South Korea, President Yoon Suk-yeol. They're trying to put pressure on the Biden administration. They're trying to put pressure on the US-ROC alliance as well. But the other elements are also applicable. This is a regime that has adapted to an environment defined by sanctions, by relying on its illicit exports that have included weapons, missiles, missile parts. Remember, you make money out of selling missiles, out of selling parts, out of training crews, and out of repairs. So they're very knowledgeable of that side of the illicit business. And quite frankly, that's how this regime has managed to survive.
Doug, how far was the Trump administration getting at right after Vietnam? How they got up to Vietnam for the negotiations, walked out. So how far did that go? How far did that go with China? How far did that go? Kim Jong-un really seemed to be very interested in getting some direct agreement or a negotiation with Donald Trump. What's your thoughts on that? And go ahead.
Well, I think a couple of things. First, it's very interesting was China's reaction to the summitry with Donald Trump. 2017 and before, China was very unhappy with North Korea. It actually agreed to new sanctions. And there was no meeting between President Xi and Kim Jong-un. Well, there are a half dozen meetings with President Park of South Korea. Indeed, she came to she was in a place of honor at the 2015 victory parade celebration for World War II. In contrast to the North Korean representative, who was way down in the nosebleed section or something. And that was very indicative. But the moment, Kim Jong-un looks like he might be opening to make a deal with the United States, suddenly Xi Jinping realized he wanted to see his good friend. And suddenly there are multiple meetings between President Xi and Kim Jong-un. So I think that showed that China at that point helped North Korea in the sense of saying, we've got your back. So that relaxed some of the pressure on Kim. The question of what kind of concessions would Kim need to make in any deal with the United States if China's there, kind of saying, don't worry, we're kind of behind you. I think that was probably part of the issue, which we didn't see much of, but was very likely there. It certainly looked to me that Kim thought he could strike a deal with Trump. And Kim's view of the deal is to get the most important sanctions off by giving up a portion of his nuclear program. Now, the question then is, would it have been possible to have essentially said, well, we're open to that, but your opening offer is not good enough. We need to have serious negotiations. The problem is the way those negotiations were structured, everything went through Kim. And so effectively, Kim wants to deal with Donald Trump. Now, we all know Donald Trump, and I hopefully don't have to kind of spell out any detail here, but the Donald is not exactly a detail man who's going to go on the specifics of a nuclear deal. And kind of if you look at the JCPOA with Iran, it's a couple hundred pages long. Whatever you think of the agreement, this is very detailed in terms of what we need to have. What we need with the North Koreans is a serious, sustained negotiation of those who understand the issues, who can come up with a framework that gets approval from the major political figures. So it looks to me like Kim essentially turned off contact with the US and South Korea after the Hanoi summit. And I assume, but I don't know, and I wish we did know, that his view was if he can't get the kind of deal he wants, that is, clearly US wants denuclearization, he's not going to give it to them, that he didn't think it was worth spending time talking about it. And I think that may be what's continuing with the Biden administration. And that's my fear, is that his decision is, we need to make a lot more of these things. And I think the missile testing missiles that can hit the US is critical, because that will give the North a genuine deterrent against the United States. And if the American president has to sit there and say, if we get involved in a war with North Korea, well, guess what? Honolulu, Los Angeles, Chicago, whatever might go up. And you don't have to believe it's certain. All you have to believe is, well, they have 100 nukes. The missiles seem they can probably hit here. All they need to do is have 2 or 3 hit, and we've got absolute catastrophe. So I'm worried that Kim's lesson from the failed negotiation now is at the moment it's build-up time, and that he will eventually come back, but we don't know when. And when he comes back, he's going to take a very hawkish position. I think he's going to be a very tough negotiator.
Greg, thank you, Doug. Greg, we've been talking in the negotiation with Chairman Kim that we would give security assurances and that there would be some kind of a guarantee of no regime change. There would be a guarantee of his government continuing. And, you know, he cited how Muammar Gaddafi was treated and how the assurances went out the window the moment a different administration came in America. Is there any credibility after Afghanistan and other things that have happened that our security assurances mean anything to North Korea?
The Kim regime has learned that nuclear weapons are critical to its survival. It will not give up these nuclear weapons. Of course, it was ready to compromise on an already overused and abused nuclear facility at Yongbyon, the Punggye testing facility. We don't know how close it is to falling apart. That said, the United States cannot offer security guarantees to a dictatorial regime that commits crimes against humanity against its own people. What happens if the people of North Korea take to the streets in the same way that the people of Romania took to the streets in December 1989? Will the United States send in an expeditionary force to crush the demonstrations and ensure the security of the Kim regime? The only way to ensure the security of the Kim regime is for Kim Jong-un to accept that the only path forward is the path of reform, transformation, economic, social, political reform. The United States, South Korea, Japan are not in the business of trying to invade North Korea. Of course, we've made our mistakes, especially in the 21st century. We also have a very good track record going back to the Marshall Plan, the reconstruction of Western Europe. The Eastern Europeans, by the way, turned it down, forced by the Soviets, the reconstruction of Japan and South Korea. And North Korea would be surrounded by thriving economies, some of them also thriving democracies, South Korea, Japan, China, not a democracy, of course, but a fairly successful economy. So they would have the economic assistance from neighboring countries, from the United States, the European Union, and others, the assistance needed to develop, but they really need to overcome this predicament where they see themselves as surrounded, as them against the entire world. But then again, this is how the Kim regime has managed to keep its people subdued. I wonder if they know any other way. But no, we cannot offer those security guarantees. It's simply impossible under the circumstances of North Korea today.
The attraction, Doug, of being able to develop North Korea, how much do you think that is in Kim Jong-un's mind? Doesn't he want to bring North Korea into this modern age?
I think the problem, and it's not just North Korea. I mean, the 20th century had a lot of dictatorships. When you have decolonization, countries want to develop a whole developing world, the third world, as we called it. And the real issue here is, well, shouldn't everybody want development? Well, the problem is sometimes development goes to the wrong people, right? You want to maintain control. You want development for your friends. You want development for the factions that support you. You want the development for your, and I think the problem for North Korea is, and I think that's what we see with the crackdown on information from South Korea, is that Kim has come to understand that once North Koreans see the reality, they know the entire system they are living is a lie, and that is very powerful. Mm. And it's not just economic. And I think that's the real fear for him. It's not just we have more stuff. It's a life where you choose, you make your own choices, et cetera, et cetera. They can see all that. So I think that's the problem, is that I think Kim would like to have development. I mean, the interesting thing was the Singapore summit. I mean, broadcast back, to North Korea, some of the images there. I mean, he's in a place that's very well developed. So, but it looks to me like he has retreated from that. And I wonder if to some degree that might reflect, pressure within the leadership. Some of the other factions might, especially in the military and in security services, might really be pressing the point. It's very hard to control this stuff. And because it does seem, again, they held a concert for K-pop. And that's 4 or 5 years ago. And now they're throwing teenagers in jail for listening to K-pop. This tells me something serious has gone on there, and it's clearly his decision. So I'm afraid he could very well have decided we don't need development. We want controlled development. So we want to get a little more, so we can have maybe some more investment zones. How can, it's the K-song strategy. How do you come up with more money coming to the regime that for the most part the regime can capture and use to reward the elite? You have to pay them all off. They need goods, nice, kind of new luxuries and whatever. And just have enough to feed the rest of the people because you have to work. And that he might very well be happy with that. I think that what they need is a new leadership. They need a leadership committed to their people, not a leadership committed to itself. And unfortunately, the Kim family dynasty is committed to the Kim family dynasty. It's not committed to the people of North Korea.
Very good. Very good. Now, China has allowed North Korea to survive, and they did not cut them off. Even when the sanctions came, coal shipments would be rejected from North Korea, but they would increase purchases on other goods that weren't sanctioned. And there was no dip in the support economically of China at all to North Korea, from everything I've studied and read and heard from our advisors. So, and then on the other hand, China will not develop North Korea. They could develop North Korea as a magnificent, exploding economy with one of the hardest, working labor forces. If they could work for themselves and their own benefit, they'd be 10 times harder working. But they're an amazing, resilient, very, very strong people. They're very tough. And that's part of the revolution that occurred, on the Han River. The whole development of South Korea is not just that technology was given to them or economic support, but it was really the tenacity and the ingenuity and the hard working and the scholarship of the people. And I see the same. Some of our advisors actually have taught in Pyongyang University, and said their students are brilliant. They study desperately because they can also have a better life if they become valuable to the regime. Why hasn't China tried to develop North Korea more?
Shall I take a shot at this first?
Go ahead.
So, of course, North Korea has been a formal ally of China since practically the establishment of the DPRK, the PRC, and the Korean War. That said, there is one stark contrast between Chinese investment in North Korea and South Korean investment in North Korea. South Korean investment in the Mount Kumgang project, the Kaesong Industrial Complex, has been politically motivated. Chinese investment, although China is communist, has been profit-driven. The Chinese have invested in North Korea as a business enterprise, and they have experienced the same problems that everybody else has experienced. The infrastructure is in shambles. You primarily have to invest in the extractive industry, but if you do that, you need to build roads, railways, you need power, you need gas, you need to front load your investment. Well, once you front loaded your investment, they will take you hostage, and then they'll start markerizing all the terms of the contract. So that's one big problem that the Chinese have had in North Korea. So again, they're more about the profit than the ideological motivation. And arguably, even the regime of Kim Jong-un is now a post-communist, post-industrial dynastic kleptocracy. So in practical terms, it's just very difficult for the Chinese to develop North Korea. They will help sustain the regime of Kim Jong-un for as long as he can keep things under control. China doesn't want instability on his borders. For as long as he can do that, he's okay. But if he loses control, if there are signs of instability, China might just step in.
Very, very interesting, Doug.
China brought Kim Jong-un's father, Kim Jong-il, to Shanghai and elsewhere. And I mean, I kind of liken it to, I mean, the famous, in the Bible where Jesus, the Satan shows up to tempt Jesus, and it's kind of like you can have all the kingdoms on earth. And they would kind of tell Kim Jong-il, you can have all of this. And from his standpoint, it's don't tempt me because I don't trust that. I mean, Kim Jong-il did not want to open up in a way that he would lose control. So the Chinese, I mean, I think the Chinese, they want a buffer state, but they want a docile buffer state. So a wealthy buffer state they can trade with, buy minerals from, et cetera, would be that what they really want, because they would have greater influence there. It wouldn't have that potential nuclear thing that might cause some trouble here or there. But they can't get that. And look, the North Koreans and Chinese don't like each other. I mean, it's one of the great,
That's right.
I mean, they talk about being lips and teeth and all this stuff. I mean, they hate each other. I mean, you go to the Great Fatherland Victory Museum. I mean, Kim Il-sung is the person who won the war. And somewhere or another, there's a little mention of the Chinese, somewhere. But mostly it's filled with these massive bronze, kind of statues and stuff showing Kim Il-sung and his buddies who are out there, kind of pushing America back. When I visited in 2017, I met with their economic officials. They talked about how their goal was not to be reliant on any one country without mentioning that country. Well, it was pretty clear who they had in mind. And when Kim Jong-un executed his uncle, the charges were all focused on China, that he was giving away resources, again, to an unnamed country. But he was the guy who was closest to the Chinese. So I think, this is one of those things where the Chinese would love to have it, but I think Greg's right, is that in the end, they will support him as long as they get what they absolutely need. But he's not going to give them what they want, because he wants to make sure he's in control, not them. And they'd love to have a different guy running things, more susceptible to their control. They don't have that, but they're not going to help us. I mean, to me, that's the critical thing to realize, is that as much as they might not like him, that does not mean they will help us. Because at the moment, I think they dislike us much more than they dislike Kim Jong-un.
Yes, the Han Empire has been the enemy of Korea for thousands of years. That's really something. But they definitely would favor China over the United States. That's so true. Final question. Feel so sorry that our time's run out, but final question to both of you, and you can just end your final remarks here. What is different about the President Yoon administration and their approach to North Korea, America, Japan, and so forth? What is really gives you some feeling of positive potential there? Go ahead, Doug, you come, and then Greg, you can wrap it up.
Well, I think President Yoon will be much more in sync with the US, and it's certainly useful to have both sides more working together. And it looks like he is serious about trying to have a rapprochement with the Japanese, as they appear to be. And that is desperately needed.
Yeah.
I mean, to have America's two democratic allies at odds, where the South Koreans seem to hate the Japanese almost as much as the North Koreans, is just not helpful. So those look to me like issues that will be very helpful. That if you can bring the allies together more to have a common position, that will be useful. It's not clear to me that will necessarily change what North Korea does, but I do think that having the good guys working together more closely is probably going to be a good thing, and will have it'll make it easier at least for Tokyo, Seoul, and Washington to coordinate, where everybody more or less has the same sense of what they're dealing with.
Very good. Thank you, Doug. Greg?
I'm in full agreement with Doug on all of the great points he's made. There is a domestic dimension in South Korea. President Moon made a lot of compromises for the sake of appeasing the Kim Jong-un regime. President Yoon Suk-yeol has a much more realistic approach. There are two particular episodes. One South Korean official was in the waters of North Korea. He was shot, killed, and burned by agents of the North Korean regime. Representatives of the South Korean government under Moon claimed that he was attempting to defect to North Korea, which turns out was not true. Moreover, 2 North Korean fishermen were forcibly repatriated to North Korea by South Korea after barely 2 days, claiming that they had committed a crime, some murder on a North Korean ship with no evidence, none other than the claims by the North Korean regime. Remember, pursuant to the Constitution of the Republic of Korea, these are citizens of the Republic of Korea returned to North Korea to conditions of danger, to credible fear of persecution. President Moon defunded NGOs, civil society organizations seeking to improve the human rights of North Koreans, banned leaflet balloon launches, investigated North Korean escapees involved in the human rights movement. All of this nonsense is going to stop under President Yoon. And of course, I learned Korean politics 101, never get involved in Korean politics. As a non-Korean, I'm not doing that, but I'm just breathing a sigh of relief, knowing that our colleagues
Very good.
bringing human democracy to the people.
Thank you. Thank you, Greg. Excellent insights. The program is so honored to have both of you. We will be inviting you back, and hopefully we can go to Korea soon together. We would like to be meeting some of the officials there, and we've had many fact finders about Korea, Japan, and the United States. We were there when the GSOMIA agreement was first put in place and acted upon, the General Security of Military Information Act. Beautiful, amazing. That meant that the governments, even though the regimes would change or the administrations would change, but the military, Korea, Japan, ROK, Japan, and the United States would continue to share intelligence. And that was threatened by this, conflict between the President Moon administration and the Abe administration. That was really, fortunately, they didn't end it. But boy, that cooperation of our military sharing one to another key information brought the 3 nations closer together, even when the administrations were at odds. Very interesting. So I think you both understand these things so well and are so helpful to our audience. We're very pleased to have this program with you. We're here every Tuesday on different topics on Korea, how to help bring the peaceful relations between North and South Korea. And we look forward to our next steps. But thank you, Mr. Doug Bondo and Mr. Greg Scarlatu. We're honored to be with you. Thank you to our audience. We'll be here next Tuesday at 2.